Here today, I've got Andrew Katay, who's CEO of City to City Australia. Andrew, thanks so much for making your time available to come and tell us about the good work that City to City is doing.
Oh, no, great to be with you, even if it is digitally and in lockdown, and certainly better than nothing, that's for sure. And a delight to be here.
We certainly live in interesting times, don't we?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Andrew, just to start off, can you tell us how long City to City has been established in Australia?
Well, it had a kind of pre-phase from 2011 to 2013, but it really took off when Tim Keller came to Sydney in a conference in March of 2014. That actually did a number of conferences, and that really threw some momentum behind City to City in Australia. That was his intention. That's why he decided that the time was right for him to come out, because there was this little organisation in place. And so really from 2014, we've existed as an organisation, a company with a structure, a board, and all that kind of stuff, and looking to plant churches from there.
Fantastic. Can you tell us a bit about the vision that you have for church planting in Australia?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, my own background was as a church pastor. I went to seminary and got ordained as a minister, and then assistant minister, and then a senior minister of a church. And I think I probably had all the same reservations about church planting that so many do, where you'd say, surely there are enough small churches that if only they grew, that was the main job, or surely there's empty buildings and just need to sort of fill those buildings with, and so on. But so I was a reluctant convert in a sense to church planting. I'll tell you the thing that convinced me, actually. It was hearing about Redeemer Presbyterian Church's support of the planting of an Anglican church in Manhattan.
Okay.
That kind of cross-denominational support of church planting was something I'd never heard of before. It's certainly not been part of my experience. And the reason was that Tim Keller, the senior pastor of Redeemer Presbyterian Church in New York, knew that there were kind of ex-Episcopalians in New York who would never go to any other church than an Episcopal church. But there wasn't a good Episcopal church for them to go to in New York at the time, he thought. And so he wanted to see another one planted. And so he knew that had to happen. And so he supported that. And I thought that sense of the necessity of creativity, of innovation, of planting new churches across boundaries, that was inspiring to me. And so I thought, if I can get involved in that in the context of Australia, which in very similar ways has a kind of fairly established church context, mostly in decline, and needs a kind of a tip of the spear element to it, which is church planting. If I can be a part of that, I'd love to do that. Yeah,
no, that's great. So whilst you're an Anglican, your ministry is not just restricted to Anglicans, is it?
Well, actually, it's interesting. My whole life in ministry has always had both a church and a parachurch element to it. So before I started in City to City, I was the chaplain at Sydney University, ministering with the Evangelical Union Christian group at Sydney University, which was itself a parachurch, pan-denominational agency. And so I think that's always been part of my own kind of experience and DNA, that denominations, whilst I think they have their place, I'm actually for the fact that there are denominations. I think it helps us get on with each other rather than fight. That's important. At the same time, there are times and places to just get beyond that. And I'm a big believer in that. And that's certainly where City to City's come from. We're very clear that we're not a denomination. We want to operate pan-denominationally.
So which denominations or networks are City to City working with at the moment?
Well, right across the board, we're trying to cover the field. So Presbyterian, Baptist, Uniting Church, Congregationalist, Churches of Christ. My favorite is a Kenyan Pentecostal church in Melbourne. And again, it just makes that point, right? That is, there's no way in the world that anything I ever did is going to touch Kenyan Pentecostals, right? There's just, and so and yet there's something that City to City has to offer in that context. And so to be able to support that and rejoice in that and celebrate it, rather than think, no, it's got to be the same as me, that would be crazy. And so that's what we do. We absolutely love that church.
No, that's fantastic. So are you finding in this environment that there is still a hunger for church planters to want a church plant?
Well, I think church planting in Australia over the recent times has gone through a number of phases. It was dormant, as far as I can tell, for a fair while in the 70s maybe and 80s. Of course, in the early part of the 20th century, there was enormous church planting as Sydney and other major cities in Australia grew rapidly. Then the Driscoll phenomenon happened. Driscoll, did his thing in the United States and came to Australia. And for a little while, church planting was kind of cool and hip and sexy and so on. I think there was more heat than light in that myself, and a lot more talk than action. And that became clear. And so the energy for church planting waned a little bit, it seemed to me. And what's, I think, emerging now actually is a much more realistic and sober, but actually substantial and fruitful focus on church planting, alongside all the other things that have to go in the ministry of the gospel in a place. So it's sort of, I think, on a more even keel.
So you were describing to me earlier about a pathway that you have for church planters, which you're quite surprised about the uptake of that at the moment. Would you mind just sharing a bit about that?
Sure. So the actual mechanics of launching a church are both really challenging, but also fairly predictable. Gathering a launch team, finding a venue, researching the area that you're going to minister to, so that you don't just sort of throw the gospel in a sort of random way, but you actually know how to contextualize what it is that the shape of the ministry that you'll be doing and the way to describe the gospel and so on. Those are fairly predictable steps. And so we have what we call a church planting residency, which is designed to take a cohort of people at pretty much the same spot through all of those steps together in a cohort situation, so they really support each other and encourage each other, and roughly plant churches around the same time. So that's our residency. It's one afternoon a week. It's quite intense, and it's extremely practical. Part of that residency typically will include what we call the City to City Asia Pacific International Intensive, and that's an element of the residency, because we take people away for 2 weeks. Until recently, out of context, that is overseas, to put them in a group of church planters, 20 or so church planters from right around the Asia Pacific region, very, very great cultural differences, which is important. And just, it's like a fire hose to the face, just content, vision, inspiration. The really fascinating thing for me is that we've had the biggest number of Australian participants in the Asia Pacific Intensive in the last 6 months than ever before. So in 6 months, we've had 17 participants in that intensive. And the conversion rate from intensive to planter is pretty high. And so it's too early. I often ask the question, is this a blip or a trend? And it's too early to know whether it's a trend or just a blip. But at the moment, we're seeing more church planters come forward than we've ever seen. 30 to 40 a year, quite remarkable.
That's incredible. It's interesting, as I'm talking to different people, I'm finding some saying that church planting has gone totally off the agenda, whilst with others, I'm finding the exact opposite, where they're finding more and more people are coming forward. So it seems very patchy around the country at the moment, very patchy, I guess I'd say.
Well, and I think the COVID situation has hit different people, different churches, different denominations differently as well. For some, it's been just an absolute body blow. I know congregations that have closed, churches that have closed, they just couldn't sustain it after the lockdown. And I think especially where congregations lean towards the more elderly group, that became very, very difficult. But on the other hand, I think COVID has opened up new opportunities, new needs. One of the things I always pray in relation to COVID is that in this time of what, frankly, in Australia still is a fairly minor level of suffering for most people, nonetheless, for many people, it's their first experience of any kind of suffering, actually.
Yes, that's right.
And, C.S. Lewis talked about suffering as God's megaphone, and I'm praying that God will be just yelling over this country and evoking a spiritual interest that perhaps has not been there before.
Yeah, absolutely. You're probably aware that the Barna Group in America are forecasting that 20% of American churches will close within 18 months as a result of COVID. And that's largely as a result of the financial model being impacted. We get at the same time in Australia, we're seeing, and other countries around the world, we're seeing seeing the disruption caused by COVID has driven leaders to innovation, beyond adaptation into innovation. And that's got to be good, because it's about finding new models, finding new ways of reaching people and doing church.
Yeah, in my own church context, where I serve as a senior pastor half-time, I think our online services, both including this year, the last couple of weeks, as well as last year, would have had more at them than our in-person services.
Yes.
That's a silver lining.
Yeah. There's a video clip on the Exponential website, Exponential Australia website, exponential.org.au, with Dave Ferguson from Exponential in the United States. And he leads Christian Community Church in Chicago. And it's a fascinating 15 or so minute video where he talks about how they've innovated. They've developed micro churches as well, even as far away as Mexico City. And also they've got their online church as well. So they've got different expressions of church that have all emerged. Andrew, just coming back to church planting for a second, you talked about the pipeline for prospective church planters. Do you put them through some form of assessment process, and do you find that as an important part?
Oh, yes. I think the statistics are extremely clear on this. Church planting agencies that have a robust assessment process have a far smaller failure rate than church planting agencies that don't have a rigorous assessment process. So no, we're very clear on that. So there's two parts of it. One is there's some formal assessments, a 360-degree assessment, which is gets feedback from a range of feedback providers in the church planter's life. It's interesting. I was never entirely convinced about these assessment tools until I started using them, and the degree of sharpness of picture that you get from these assessment tools about a person is quite remarkable. You feel once you get used to how to interpret the data, you do get a real sense of the strengths and the gaps that the person has. Everyone has strengths. Everyone has gaps. Actually, there is no perfect church planter, and that's important. We don't typically use the tool to say yes or no, you'll be hopeless. I know we have planters connected with us who've been told no by other places who've gone on to plant fruitful churches. So it's more a case of our approach to the assessment tool is primarily to do with where will coaching and support and training be needed as you go down the church planting journey. And so we use it to inform our ongoing coaching and training mostly.
Yeah, I think that the whole thing of coaching, it's coming more and more onto into the mainstream of church planting. But for me, as well as the assessment process, coaching, again, it's such a critical part of the whole church planting process. And as you say, it ties into the assessment process, because what you learn through doing the assessments will very much guide you.
Yeah.
Andrew, just one other thing I wanted to talk to you about, or two other things before we finish. One of the things is the work that you're doing with church revitalisation. Could you describe that a little bit to us, and why the need to do that?
Yeah, well, this has come about for a couple of reasons. One of the reasons is that I think probably 2/3, perhaps even up to 3/4 of churches in Australia are either plateaued or declining. And at the roughest of back of the envelope estimates, I think that's probably about 3,000 more or less Bible-based churches in Australia would be plateaued or declining right now. And my own experience personally in the church where I've served as a senior minister, and many other churches I've seen around, is that it's not impossible to turn churches around. It really isn't. It's doable, which leads to the second thing. One of the particular ways that it's doable is through congregation planting alongside the existing congregations that there are in those churches. And it's that congregation planting piece that has really kind of opened our eyes to this possibility, because it brings together, on the one hand, the experience that City City has in facilitating and enabling church planting, together with the strength of an existing church, its place in the community, its physical resources and infrastructure, and so on. And so in a way, you get almost the best of both worlds. You get the creativity and energy and innovation of congregation planting alongside the existing resources that there are in the church, and not being subject to the whims of school principals as to whether you can meet there and so on. And so we're seeing a real possibility for church planting. We've hired some what we're calling lead consultants to work with churches in order to do this revitalization of churches through congregation planting. And we're looking very much forward to rolling it out. We've got a name for this as a program. We're calling it Revitalise Australia.
Right.
So it's it's a slightly ambitious name, but there you go. And looking to kind of do a bit of a social media blitz in August, and make that available as a possibility to more and more churches around the country.
Oh, that sounds exciting. You might be interested to know that I've had some preliminary research results from the NCLS, where based on the 2016 database, so they have found that 50% of Australian churches are in decline and 19% are stable, which adds up to 69%,
Wow,
which is pretty close on the figure that you came up with.
Yeah. And it doesn't have to be that way. I think, and you can tell that because the other 31 or whatever, presumably, are growing. That is, it's just not the case that it's impossible for a church to grow, because there are churches that are growing.
Absolutely. No, that's fantastic. That's great. Now, one last thing, Andrew, you've got an event coming up at the end of September this year. That's September 2021. Would you mind just sharing with us a little bit about that event?
Well, one of the kind of sayings that Tim Keller has that I think is incredibly important is that it takes a movement to reach a city. It takes a movement to reach a city. And a movement of the gospel can never be the effort of just one denomination or one network or one church planting agency. It's got to be broader than that, because the community, the city, is broader than any one agency. Different types of people, different languages. My Kenyan Pentecostal example just shows that. And so the conference in September is designed to bring together everyone who has a sense of this necessity for movement, of what it would be in the cities or even the sub-cities of Australia, to collaborate together in appropriate ways, not the old-fashioned, ecumenical movement or the ministers fraternal or these sorts of things, but actually with a real sharp, pointy end to it, to collaborate in a way that would see catalyzed movements of the gospel in the cities and sub-cities of Australia. And so we're hoping that we can bring together like-minded people. We know there's a whole bunch of people like this in Perth that are really way ahead in their thinking. And so we want to get their learning in the room. We've got the world's leading writers on movement are actually here in Australia. Steve Addison and Al Hirsch. And so they'll be speaking at the conference. But it's not, the conference is not so much top-down plenary speakers and so on. That'll be great input. It'll be the working together and figuring out what might movements look like in the different cities and sub-cities.
Yeah, no, that's great. It's sounds like it's going to be an exciting event. I'm very much looking forward to it as well.
Well, likewise. And can I just say too, I'm particularly excited to see the emergence of Exponential in Australia. I just think that that's an absolutely critical offering of leadership that is being made and is needed, because this idea of movement, which says that agencies have to be for each other, not against each other, not even just ignoring each other, but celebrating each other, seems to me to be one of the biggest hurdles to overcome, one of the greatest challenges that we have. We're too much like our country. Our country is a divided, fractious, cranky country in lots of ways. You see the way that Sydney talked about Melbourne in lockdown, and now Melbourne talks about Sydney in lockdown, and all that sort of thing. And the church too often looks like it's city, right? The Corinthian church was like that.
That's right.
And we don't want to be like that. And so I'm really delighted that Exponential's offering this leadership, and I'm all behind it.
Fantastic. Thank you, Andrew. And I've got to say, I'm really enjoying our interactions and partnering with you in this as well, because it's all for the sake of the gospel, for the sake of Christ reaching our nation. And Christ is bigger than any of us and any of our movement.
Amen to that. Yeah,
okay. Andrew, again, thanks so much for making your time available. Really appreciate you and what you're bringing to this nation.
Thanks, Tim. Great to be here.